We're here with opportunity to speak with Charles, and just following on from what we were just talking about in the previous session was measuring knowledge and performance and the experiences in between, and sort of post after action reviews and applying feedback. And one of the things that we started to touch about or talk about was the use of big data learning analytics and how that plays into things. And certainly with subject matter expertise, creating user generated content and curating that information, I guess it's important for us to, to start measuring. And it's something we hear a lot about, Charles, at the moment, in terms of measuring the impact of learning and the value of learning, and user generated content as part of that. High performing teams we talked about, but then using data analytics to help do that. If you've got so many sort of insights into how people might go about that.
Yeah, I think, Rod, it's one of the major challenges that learning and development professionals and learning and development teams have is, how do we know that what we're doing is having an impact? And I think, we've had tools for years and years that give us, 4 levels or 5 levels or whatever of measuring engagement and measuring these sorts of things. But actually, I think now with the huge amount of data that we have access to, generally our organizations have access to generally, I think it plays into helping L&D measure impact. And my colleagues and I have always said for years that if you want to measure impact, you use business metrics. So if I want to measure, if we're running, for example, a first level leadership program or first level manager program, or if we're running a customer service program, what we really need to do is to measure how that's impacting the performance of a first level manager, or how that's impacting the performance of a customer service team. So really the metrics we should be using should be business KPIs. And you say, Rod, we've got lots and lots of data, and pretty well every organization, every industry is being swamped with vast amounts of data, and we can use that. So we don't need to create our own metrics. I mean, learning metrics are useful. Knowing that people complete a course, knowing that people achieve some particular specific outputs from learning outputs is useful for us internally, because it tells us if for example is a course, it tells us whether that course is, whether people appreciated it, whether getting that initial feedback. That's sort of useful for us internally, but we should never be presenting that to our stakeholders. I don't know of any stakeholders that are really interested in course completions unless it's a compliance or regulatory issue, because the compliance and regulatory bodies haven't got beyond, haven't worked out metrics beyond everyone's been through a fire awareness program or some compliance program. So in some cases we're required by regulation to provide that data, but the data that's really meaningful, that's not really meaningful data. The data that's really meaningful is, how are we moving the lever or the needle in terms of performance? So can I give you, let me tell you a story. When I was Chief Learning Officer at Reuters, we had an issue with our customer support teams, and the global head of customer support and I had a meeting, and he explained that the feedback from our customers was that our technical people didn't understand our products. And yet I knew we were spending somewhere north of £1 million a year training them on product knowledge. And so we went and looked at this really carefully. And there was a major problem in a center in St. Louis in the US. And we looked at it and went and listened in on some calls. And we gathered data. And we realized that what the problem was that these people were supporting Reuters financial products. So most of the calls they were taking from people working on trading desks, often when they were having problems. And I think most of us know that the characteristics of people who work on trading desks by necessity is they're usually pretty bullish. It's a tough world. There's big wins and big losses. And so they were having to pick up calls from people who were shouting down the telephone saying, my data feed's down, this isn't working, whatever. And the problem was nothing to do with with their product knowledge. The problem was to do with managing difficult conversations. So in that case, it was actually having data and having observational data as well as just data in terms of the satisfaction of clients. It was actually having observational data to understand what the problem was. We put in a solution which was actually a formal course, but it wasn't a course on product knowledge. It was a course on managing difficult conversations. So we have that. The other problem that bit of the organization had was that the CSAT figures, the customer satisfaction figures, were not that great. And so the head of customer service, I said to him, Richard, what really matters to you? What do you want to see change? And he just laughed. He said, Charles, the only thing that matters to me is moving that CSAT figure up by 3% by the end of the year. He said, it matters to me because my 18% of my bonus is on that. So he then looked at me and he said, if we work on this together, would you be prepared to put 18% of your bonus on moving that CSAT figure up? And I said, absolutely, I would. So, well, and of course, he then went and changed the bonus structure for his team, his regional managers. So they were all aligned. I did the same for my head of learning for sales and service. And we were all focused on that one measure. So talking about, measuring, the only measure that we focused on for that particular project was how can we help to increase the customer satisfaction figures. And a third-party company interviewed a subset of our clients every week. We got a report every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks we could see how it was moving. And Rod, it was the only time in my career when I knew that I had 18% of my bonus in the bank by August, because it just worked, because we were all focused. We weren't focused on our learning people, weren't focused on, learning. They were focused on how what we're doing is delivering what we need. And sometimes when the CSAT figure didn't go up, we'd meet and say, well, what can we do differently? How can we change? So it was just a continuous improvement process in terms of getting that done. And if you step back from that sort of small example and think about how do we measure what we're doing, I think there's a couple of sort of base rules. One is use the metrics wherever possible that the stakeholders use, because they're going to be meaningful to them. And often they already do that. They've got lots of data. So you don't start from a blank sheet of paper. You can actually, when you start out, to look at how do we design the solution, the learning solution that we're designing. We've got a lot of data, so we know where the trouble, where the pinch points are, where the issues are. We know where things are going well, where we maybe don't have to focus. So I think that, at a very high level, if we think about measuring, we should just be mining data that exists in our organization in order to do it. I mean, and in doing our work, we'll also be gathering lots of data ourselves, but it really it's around, our stakeholders' data.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we see people getting sort of stuck, not being able to see the forest from the trees in terms of reporting, I suppose. So inwardly, I guess because we're building a lot of learning and e-learning and putting a lot of statements in so people can track things on learning record stores and LXPs and the like. We're finding that people are getting stuck with the data and not knowing what to do with the data, how to get meaning out of the data and interpret the data, and tracking the wrong things, or not, not looking outward, they're only looking inward of, yes, if we want to measure how often someone clicks the closed captions on the video to then determine the importance for accessibility is one thing, but the important data that we need is the business KPIs and the performance. And like the learning leaders need to be mapping back to that, and as you said, Charles, speaking the same language and showing the data that is most important to the business, without getting stuck looking inward all the time. So that's a really good point you made.
Yeah, and I think there's no doubt, Rodney, that L&D needs to build its capability in terms of, we need data scientists. We need people in L&D who really understand data, because when we're working, whether we're working with stakeholder data, whether we're building our own data, we need people who have the skills and capability to really understand that, to analyze it, and to be able to separate, particularly to be able to separate between the difference between correlation and causality. Often we say, and you hear this a lot, the let me take an example. Often a statement that's often made is, we've increased the engagement of our employees by X and the performance of the organization has gone up. Therefore, we're going to focus on engagement work. Now, actually, if you have a data scientist and someone who can research this, they would understand that the research tells us that there is a correlation between engagement and performance, but it's not what we think it is. In fact, more engaged teams are not necessarily higher performing teams, but higher performing teams are almost invariably more engaged teams. So in other words, performance drives engagement, engagement doesn't drive performance. In fact, a German academic called Michael Ricketta did a meta-study showing this. So again, if you're a data scientist, you would look at that and you wouldn't just take for granted that, oh, we've got increased engagement, performance is going up, we keep focusing on engagement. The answer is, sure, they're going up, but why is that? What's the causal relationship rather than what's the correlation? So I guess that's just putting a scientific hat on and working from sort of first principles. And I think that's really important that we do that, because we get all sorts of assumptions made, which often turn out to be false assumptions. And when there is research that shows that, and the nature of science, things changing all the time, we're finding new things all the time. So I certainly think, big data is potentially hugely valuable. We need in L&D people who can understand how to work with data and how to make the best use of it. But simply having big data by itself can lead to issues such as the engagement performance conundrum. And I'm afraid, most HR, when I talk to HR people around the world, I was in Leipzig in Germany a couple of weeks ago, speaking at an HR conference. Most HR people have been sold this story that we need to focus on engagement, on employee engagement. Of course, employee engagement is a good thing to focus on. Happier people, it's better to have happier people in your organization, because there is a correlation between engagement and retention. In other words, if you want to keep people in your organization, it's much better to engage people, are less likely to leave. But the performance link is actually a different one. And our HR colleagues have been sold this story that employee engagement is the be all and end all, and millions of dollars, pounds, euro, yen are spent on engagement programs, which are great if you've got an issue with people leaving the organization, but aren't great if you're looking for high performance.
Yeah. Well, you've touched on something else, and I'm conscious of time. We might have to have another session, but touching on the skills that the learning and development need to have, and what we need to be doing differently from the way that we've been doing the learning design and development of artifacts. We've touched on user-generated content and big data reporting and alike, but something that would be good to, on another session, to talk about is the skills that we can have as learning and development to be able to, achieve the KPIs for the business, but then how that changes our roles as well. So if we can catch you for another session, that'd be great, Charles. So thank you very much for your time.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.